Let's talk about the economy. Obviously, the economy continues to be a top issue for American voters. I'm at Forbes, I'm a reporter here at Forbes. We cover entrepreneurship in great length. So I'm curious, what do you think is needed to spur entrepreneurship and prosperity in America today?
The first thing we need to do is balance our budget. This runaway federal spending is creating high interest rates and high inflation. The poor are getting poorer in our country under Joe Biden, which is supposed to be a Democratic president who cares about the poor. So I think that's number one. Number two, we have to recognize the dynamic challenges that are in front of us, right? How do we propel our economy? We have to invest heavily in AI and advanced microchips in the space industry. We have to talk about crypto. We have to talk about virtual reality. So these are the technologies that are going to define the future. America has to win in those races, right? And to build the country, the companies of the future. And then we have to protect our IP from being stolen by China, that doesn't have the same educational system that we do, where people across the world get educated in our country to create prosperity in theirs. So I think that's number two in terms of dynamism, and I think that'll also help us with our deficit. If we are being more productive, we're going to have smaller deficits on the revenue side, right? What I did in Miami was I lowered taxes to the lowest level ever, and we had double-digit growth. So I actually had more resources with less tax, implemented revenue. So it's a counter narrative to what's happening in American cities and in the country, where you think that government is the solver of all problems. Government is not the solver of all problems. Americans are the solver of all problems.
Balancing the budget does sound like every politician's dream. So, what specifically would you do within your first year, let's say you're elected, to balance the budget?
The first thing you have to do is you have to propose a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, to make it a requirement. That's the world that local and state governments live under. There's no reason why the federal government shouldn't play by the same rules as families do at the dinner table. And also, of course, there's going to be exceptions for pandemics and for wars and conflicts and things of that nature. But we should be required to balance our budget every single year. It should be a constitutional requirement, just like it is in the Constitution of the state of Florida, in the Constitution of the city of Miami. So that's number one. Number two, to balance a budget, and I did it, a 20-year cut in expenses. I'm going to tell you right now, it's painful. There's no way to avoid the pain, right? There's no way to say, oh, this is not going to be ugly. It is going to be ugly. And the reason why it's going to be ugly is because we have let things get out of control. And we have continued to play with fictitious money for years. And so, unfortunately, the discipline that it requires to undo that is extremely painful. It is necessary, because right now we just delayed being, up against the fiscal cliff with the debt ceiling debate, and we just postponed it for a year. And so we're going to be back here after the presidential election, right after the presidential election, having the same debate. And if we have a default of the federal government, it is going to have cataclysmic economic consequences, not just for America, but for the world. And so we've got to confront this issue. I did it in Miami. No other candidate has done it, and it wasn't easy.
When you say that balancing the budget, it's ugly, it's not pretty, it's going to hurt, who exactly is that affecting? And is it disproportionate?
Well, it affects Americans, just like it affects Americans right now to have, high interest rates, just like it affects Americans to have high inflation, right? The consequence of playing with fake money hurts Americans, right? And to get that back into balance, it's going to hurt in the short run. Until we get it back under control, but then it's going to benefit tremendously in the long run. Part of the reason why Miami's had, a decade plus of economic success is because we've kept spending under control. And so we have the largest surplus in our history. We have the largest annual surplus, and we have the highest bond rating we've ever had. So we're the best credit worthiness, which also keeps borrowing costs down. So that has another impact on expenses.
Would that impact, you say it's impacting Americans, but would it disproportionately impact, let's say, poor Americans above, instead of the middle class, upper class?
Well, I think excess and runaway government spending is disproportionately right now impacting poor people, because the people that feel it the most are the ones that have the least yield on their investments, right? So if you have your money in a bank account, you're losing purchasing power. If you have to borrow money, if you're not wealthy and have cash and you have to borrow money, you're feeling it in your bank account, because now the cost of borrowing has gone up. So right now, the consequence of doing nothing is hurting poor Americans. That's why I say under Joe Biden's America, the poor get poorer.